Cuba became a problem for the CIA when they watched this young activist with an affinity for cigars lead a communist revolution on the island, throwing out the American-friendly dictator and nationalizing all the valuable land and industries that American businesses had been getting rich off for decades. This was the Cold War, and communism was now 90 miles away, threatening to spread to other countries in Latin America, countries that American businesses also wanted to continue controlling and exploiting. And any day, this new leader could align with the Soviet Union, giving the US's biggest geopolitical rival a military base within breathing distance of Florida. The US had a few solutions to their problem. First, they put an embargo on Cuba, blocking all US exports to the country, except for food and medicine. Second, they stopped buying Cuba's largest export, sugar. This actually ended up backfiring when the Soviet Union stepped in to buy Cuban sugar, kicking off an economic alliance between these two communist countries, exactly what the US didn't want. And third, the US started making plans. Lots of plans to somehow get rid of Castro, to turn Cuba back into the American business-friendly client state, through whatever means necessary. In one of these secret plans called Operation Zapata, the CIA recruited 1,500 Cuban exiles who fled to Miami during the Cuban Revolution. It was this little CIA-funded army called Brigade 2506, and the goal was to have them invade Cuba and remove Castro from power. So the CIA trains them at this camp in the mountains of Guatemala, where they had just recently executed a coup and installed a US-friendly dictator. And right in the middle of the planning stages of this operation, JFK wins the presidency.
Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country.
And he inherits this scheme to invade Cuba using exiled Cubans. The CIA briefs him on it, this plan to fix the Cuba problem by forcibly unseating Castro using Cuban exiles. And after some debate, JFK approves the plan. So on the 17th of April 1961, they launched their invasion. Brigade 2506 landed on Playa Girón with the plan to invade the island and spark a popular revolution against Castro.
The assault has begun on the dictatorship of Fidel Castro. Landings were effected by rebels at several...
But it was a complete failure. Castro had found out about the invasion ahead of time. A radio station on the beach had spotted the invading ships arriving and called for help. Several of the invading ships sank on the coral reef, and the invading forces were met with immediate resistance from Cuban armed forces who defeated them within 3 days. Most of them were captured. 9 US servicemen actually flew combat missions in support of this invasion, 4 of which were shot down and killed in the process, something the US government and the CIA would go on to deny for almost 30 years. But the point is that this invasion failed miserably, and JFK and his administration were to blame. JFK would later fire the CIA director, holding him responsible for the disastrous invasion plan that we know as the Bay of Pigs. But this didn't change anything. The US government was still obsessed with removing Castro from power. They just needed a new plan, aka Operation Mongoose. Over the next year, the CIA employs hundreds of spies to collect intelligence on Cuba. They send submarines on recon missions to Cuban waters. They fund anti-Castro protest movements, spreading propaganda throughout the country. They sabotage Cuban infrastructure to create chaos. And they make dozens more plans to assassinate Castro directly, including preparing poisonous pills to be planted in a beverage to be drunk by Castro. They even hired the American mafia to deliver the pills, knowing that the mafia had their casinos kicked out of Havana during the revolution and would want revenge. But none of this worked. The assassination attempts all fell apart. Fidel Castro still remained in power, and his support wasn't wavering. And the US military was getting desperate. They needed to solve the Cuba problem before the Soviets could get more involved on the island. So after all these botched assassination attempts and failed invasions, the Joint Chiefs of Staff concluded that the only way to get rid of Castro was for the US military itself to invade Cuba and take him out. But they knew that the US public would not support an outright invasion. They needed to create a reason, a justification. And this gets us back to our document. The one that went to the Secretary of Defense for the President's approval. This cover and deception plan to make attacks on American targets, fake attacks that will be blamed on Cuba to raise tensions between the US and Cuba to justify an invasion, a legitimate provocation as the basis for a US military intervention in Cuba. In other words, a lie to the American public and the international community, a series of false flags to get what they wanted, and all detailed in this classified document that was only meant for a few people, with hopes that the president would approve in the spring of 1962. So let's see what this plan actually says. It starts with the US military base at Guantanamo Bay, where they would start rumors using fake radio stations and get American-friendly locals to stage fake attacks on the base, starting riots in the surrounding area. Another proposed part of the plan was to blow up a US ship and blame it on Cuba. This was specifically called out as a, quote, remember the Maine incident, referencing the sinking of an American warship in Cuba in the late 1800s that the US used to justify intervening in Cuba back then to fight the Spanish. This is often thought of as a planned sabotage to justify the intervention. And here was the US military in the 60s at it again. The document predicts that the newspapers would start reporting on the casualties, causing a helpful wave of national indignation. They also wanted to create a fake terrorist campaign on American soil in Miami or Washington. They wanted to sink boats of Cuban refugees and stage the shooting of refugee targets, and even suggested exploding a few plastic bombs in American cities. These weren't all going to be pretend. They even say in the document that they would go to the extent of wounding people and then making fake arrests with prepared documents so it could all be widely publicized, making Cuba look like an irresponsible government worthy of American intervention. They thought through having American Air Force pilots fly over places like Nicaragua and drop bombs on cane fields to burn them down using weapons from the Soviet Union. But for this to work, they would have to be flying Cuban military-style aircraft. They would need to ensure that their planes were properly painted. They would also use these planes to harass American civilian aircraft, making it look like it was the Cubans doing this. They planned a fake hijacking of commercial planes to blame the Cuban government, or to fake shooting down a civilian airliner. And if that wasn't enough, the Joint Chiefs planned to create an incident which will make it appear that communist Cuban jets have destroyed a US Air Force aircraft while it was flying over international waters in an unprovoked attack. Operation Northwoods never happened. JFK's rejection of this plan is one reason that there was a rift between him and the military, with the military wanting to take a hard line on Cuba, and JFK feeling the sting of the Bay of Pigs invasion, thinking that something like this was too much of a risk. A month later, another document came to him, the Joint Chiefs following up with another memo saying that the only way to remove the communist regime was military intervention by the United States, and that Cuba was a vital base of operations for espionage, sabotage, and subversion against other countries in the region. The fear was that communism would spread across Latin America because of this, and time is running out. The rift between JFK and the military continued during the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the Joint Chiefs hoped to deploy nuclear missiles against the Soviets and invade Cuba, but JFK stood up to the military once again and said no. JFK eventually went on to deny General Lehman Lemnitzer another term as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, likely because of his leading role in planning Operation Northwoods.
So this is from Miami New Times. It says CIA considered bombing Miami and killing refugees to blame Castro. 2,800 papers released from the Nation Archives includes new documents confirming details of America's decades-long quest to kill or depose Fidel Castro, including a fairly shocking plan by the CIA to sow terror in Miami. After Castro's revolution succeeded and thousands of Cubans fled to South Florida, the CIA intelligence agency actually considered murdering a boatload of refugees, assassinating exile leaders, and planting bombs in Miami. Also, Castro could be blamed for the chaos. The basic idea was to turn world opinion against Castro and justify a U.S. military invasion by pinning the atrocities on him. The details of this sinister plot are part of Operation Mongoose. That's a 1960 covert op hatched by the CIA with the aim of toppling communist Cuba. The paper sent by General Edward Lansdale, a top Cold War officer who worked with the CIA to plot out Operation Mongoose. He sent the report to General Maxwell Taylor, who became chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And here is part of it. We could develop a communist Cuban terror campaign in the Miami area, in other Florida cities, and even in Washington. The terror campaign could be pointed at Cuban refugees seeking haven in the United States. We could sink a boatload of Cubans en route to Florida. We could foster attempts on lives of Cuban refugees in the United States, even to the extent of wounding, in instance to be widely publicized, exploding a few plastic bombs in carefully chosen spots. The arrest of Cuban agent and the release of prepared documents substantiating Cuban involvement also would be helpful in projecting the idea of an irresponsible government. He mentioned specifically the possibility of producing crop failures by the introduction of biological agents, which would appear to be of natural origin. Mr. Bundy said that he had no worries about any such sabotage, which could clearly be made to appear as the result of local Cuban disaffection or of natural disaster, but that we must avoid external activities such as the release of chemicals, etc., unless they could be completely covered up.
But what you mentioned with Operation Northwoods, it was signed off on by the U.S. government, by the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the Pentagon. JFK, he had to call it off at the last second. This would have been an attack on U.S. citizens. Then you have 1976, the bombing of Cubana Flight 455 by Luis Posada Carriles, a CIA agent, killing scores of Cubans, civilians. They killed the whole North Korean Olympic fencing team went down in the flight. Posada Carriles bragged, "We put the bombs." Him and his accomplice Orlando Bosch were ultimately brought to Miami, and Miami inaugurated Orlando Bosch Day when Jeb Bush was the governor of Florida. Honoring terrorists. You have Felix Rodriguez, a CIA agent, decorated CIA agent, who participated in the Bay of Pigs, captured Che Guevara, presided over his killing, then went on to work with Ali North in the covert operations that saw money from narco cartels financing the death squads across Central America. Felix Rodriguez was even a participant in the torture and killing of a DEA agent, a drug enforcement agency agent named Kiki Camarena, who was captured by the Guadalajara cartel in Mexico and tortured to death. And Rodriguez was there to make sure he was killed and tortured. He taped the torture. This was all on behalf of Ali North and the U.S. government, and it was to make sure that the drug money from the Guadalajara cartel continued to be financing the Contras in Central America. Then you have biowarfare by the CIA against Cuba. In 1971, Newsweek revealed that a virus from a U.S. military base had been sent by fishing boats into Cuba. The next year, swine fever was introduced by CIA agents, the African swine fever, to Cuba, killing 500,000 pigs, forcing Cuba to basically wipe out its entire pig population, which led to hunger and massive food rationing. This is well-documented stuff. A biological warfare against Cuban poultry production was introduced years later by the CIA. The CIA has introduced hemorrhagic conjunctivitis and dengue fever into Cuba, killing possibly hundreds of people, diseases to kill Cuba's sugar crop. A leader of a Cuban terrorist group in 1984 called Omega 7 admitted in a U.S. court that he participated in U.S. biowarfare against Cuba. And, it continues today.